Good evening, everyone. How are you doing?
Great.
Good. It's great to see you all. I would like to welcome you to another event in our Krasno Global Event Series. There are a few seats available here at the front, so you don't have to hide in the back. Please come forward, and please don't stand, but please sit down here. It's great to see you again. I'm Klaus Larres, as you know, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And today we have a very distinguished speaker. It's a Japanese diplomat. I will say more about Noriyuki in a minute. I would just like to remind you, we have still our YouTube channel. Don't forget watching and subscribing to it. We still have our mailing list, so if you're not on the mailing list, let us know, please. And we have, of course, our website where you can see what is coming up next. Today we will have a talk about Japan and China and their difficult relationship and their collaboration and their rivalry in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm very pleased to welcome a senior Japanese diplomat, that is Noriyuki Shikata. Noriyuki is at the moment at Harvard at the Weatherhead Center, where he's doing research on Japan and China. He's a visiting scholar there. He, until very, very recently, he was a deputy ambassador, the Japanese deputy ambassador in Beijing in China, and he was there for many years. Before that, he was director for the North American division and also director for Asian and Oceanic affairs at the Japanese Foreign Ministry in Tokyo. And once he has finished his time at Harvard in a few months' time, he will go back to Tokyo to pick up another probably very prestigious and distinguished job at the Foreign Ministry, and then in all likelihood he will be posted to a foreign country as an ambassador. So it is really a great pleasure to welcome Noriyuki here. Nori and I, we met in Beijing in 2018, and I have to admit we went out for many very pleasant Japanese lunches, and it was always good to talk to Nori. And when I heard that he was at Harvard for a little while, then I said, you have to come. I can't afford to fly you over from China or from Japan, but from Boston, that's a different matter. And luckily, Nori found the time to come here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me, join me in welcoming Noriyuki Shikata.
Good evening. Well, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. As Professor Larres mentioned, we got to know each other very well when Professor Larres was staying in Beijing. And we talked a lot about what's going on in China. There are so many issues to talk about between ourselves. And it's really great to come back to North Carolina, this region. Actually, this is my third visit to this region. Actually, I became a diplomat after I came to the United States as a high school exchange student. Actually, I lived in southwestern Missouri, or Missouri as they call it, in the Ozarks, and I stayed on the farm for 1 year. I stayed with a family. My host brother was a 6'5" star basketball player. My host sister, former cheerleader. My host father was a former American football player. So I really enjoyed the kind of heartland of the United States, and although I understand that North Carolina is not I guess you don't regard yourself as part of Midwest, but still I kind of sense the kind of the spirits of heartland or maybe South, so I'm really glad to be back. Actually, when I first came to North Carolina, it was almost 30 years ago when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and I wanted to visit different parts of the states, and of course, this was one of the destinations for me to come. And as Klaus mentioned, I was working on some U.S.-Japan trade issues, trade and economic issues, and at that time I wanted to take a look at what's going on in this part of the country, and of course this area, as you call it, the research triangle, is pretty famous among Japanese companies. I understand that in North Carolina, there are the Japanese investments have been on the rise, and there are now about 170 Japanese companies represented in this state of North Carolina. And when I visited this research triangle, I found out that the Japanese companies are starting to invest in advanced manufacturing and research-oriented industries, such as biotechnology, life science, pharma, IT, and nanotech. And of course, this is as a result of universities, such as this university, or Duke, or I guess a state university. There are a number of excellent universities. And what I'm hoping is that there will be more Japanese students who could come to this region. I wonder if there are any Japanese students? No. So that's the major issue. And I think this is very important, to promote student exchanges, and vice versa. We hope, that students here would have opportunities to come to Japan to study or to work. Of course, there are not only these areas, but I understand that there are other regions in the States which has been attracting Japanese investment. And I was doing kind of research on this. You call it the Piedmont Triangle? Greensboro, Winston, Salem, and High Point. And I understand that this Honda aircraft company, or Honda Jet, decided to invest in this area, because of its growth potential. So Honda, as you know, is got started with the motorcycle, and they became the auto company, and then they are kind of starting to get into this new jet business, and North Carolina is the basis for them to manufacture new Honda Jet, as I understand. And of course, as for trade relations, I understand that about $1.6 billion of goods annually exported from North Carolina to Japan. And Japan is, I think, the largest export destination for the state of North Carolina in terms of foreign countries. I was looking at some of the statistics between 2007 and 2016, about 10 years period. Japanese companies invested about 1.8 billion in this state, creating over 5,000 jobs by 50 companies. And so I understand that this relation between Japan and North Carolina is deepening, and we still have a lot of potential for us to move on. So let me turn my talk to today's main theme of Japan-China relations. So I was kind of trained as American specialist in Japanese Foreign Service. So initially, as I mentioned, I came to the United States a little over 30 years ago to do my graduate studies. Went to Washington, D.C. To work for the embassy of Japan. I was a press officer. In those days, we had a very intensive U.S.-Japan trade frictions. So it was in the year 1989, 1991, and those days, we had very, very kind of heightened tensions in terms of U.S.-Japan trade relations, which started in the 60s, lasted until mid 90s. So I kind of experienced these trade frictions those days, but of course now the focus of the attention from I guess American trade policies viewpoint is China, and I would probably be able to talk about this issue further in the question and answer session. I used to be, trade negotiator, and I was working with the U.S. government officials, including United States trade representatives. So I moved from those issues to manage U.S.-Japan alliance, or I was working on multilateral issues such as OECD. At one time I was working on Middle Eastern issues, so I was doing different things, but started to work on Japan-China relations about a little over 4 years ago. And so today I would like to discuss the kind of developments in the context of Japan-China relations during the last several years, and discuss current status in terms of Japan-China relations, U.S.-Japan relations, among others. So now I belong to Harvard University's program on U.S.-Japan relations, but my actual research theme is focused on emerging U.S. Trade policy to China and its implications for international trading system. So this is actually not the main theme of today's topic, but I can discuss it later. Regarding Japan-China relations, some of you may remember about 8 years ago, September 2012, there were major kind of developments in terms of Japan-China relations. Japanese government at that time, Prime Minister Noda, decided to kind of transfer the ownership of 3 Senkaku Islands in East China Sea from Japanese private owners to the government. And there was a move on the side of Tokyo Metropolitan Government, governor at that time, Governor Ishihara, wanted to purchase those islands. And I understand that in kind of as related to this development, the Japanese government decided to purchase those islands. But that prompted a very strong reaction from China, and there were like demonstrations in front of Japanese embassy in Beijing, and over at more than 50 cities in China there were demonstrations, and so those demonstrations became violent, and some of Japanese supermarkets or restaurants operated by Chinese people were also attacked. So this was a major kind of development, and this was deeply kind of the concerning situations. After that, like Chinese Coast Guard vessels started to intervene more into territorial waters of Senkaku Islands, and the Chinese capability of those vessels started to be strengthened, and vessels including with weapons. And the following year, China announced the establishment of Air Defense Identification Zone. We call it the ADIZ or ADIZ in the East China Sea, kind of changing the status quo, and the Japanese side strongly lodged protests against it as an act of unilaterally changing the status quo in the East China Sea. At that time, I was posted in the embassy in London, and I was also discussing with my friends at the U.S. government, and of course, there is the element of a kind of tyranny of distance. When you are exposed to those situations in your neighborhood, you kind of find more threats, coming from your neighbor. So it was kind of my job to share some common understanding with our European friends, including British friends. And that around that time coincided with the change of administration in Japan from what we call DPJ administration at that time to the current Prime Minister, Abe Shinzo. He was Prime Minister of Japan between 2006 and 2007, and he came back to Prime Minister's position after nearly 5 years. And actually what the Prime Minister Abe did was that he tried to diplomatically engage the Chinese side, and gradually we have started to see improvement of bilateral relations. But this was not an easy process. In November 2014, 2 years after this heightened tension, we came up with some of the basic principles toward improvement of relations. And in the meantime, Japanese companies, after this autumn of 2012, started to divest from China to countries like Southeast Asia or India. And there was probably perceived risks associated with investing in China. And that was probably not received positively by Chinese officials because, of course, since the Premier Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up after 1978, there are so many Japanese companies who have invested in China. Mr. Deng Xiaoping came to Japan and in 1978 and met with the executives, heads of Japanese companies such as Panasonic, Nissan, and New Nippon Steel. And all those leaders received the request to invest in China, and all of them decided to do so. And that was the beginning of the Japanese investment in China from the late 70s. And it continued in the 80s. Japan was actually making the case, as I remember, after Tiananmen, incident in 1989. About a year after that, there was a G7 economic summit held in Houston, and it was held at Rice University, and Japan was making the case that we should try to engage China to integrate into the international economic system. Getting back to the day, so what I was trying to say is that maybe it is possible that Chinese, there are some officials on the Chinese side that like diversion of investment from China to other countries by Japanese companies is not received very well in China. In early August 2016, I assumed the post of Deputy Director General for Asian and Oceania Affairs, and I was mainly focused on Japan-China relations. And a few days after that, there were a number of Chinese fishing vessels, along with Chinese Coast Guard vessels, intervened into territorial waters of Senkaku Islands. So again, although there was a sign of rapprochement, the tension escalated again. And at that time, it so happened that we were preparing for a trilateral foreign ministers meeting among Japan, China, and South Korea. We were debating whether we should go ahead and host this foreign ministers meeting. At the end of the day, then Foreign Minister Kishida decided that this is something we should do. We need to talk between Japan and China. So we went ahead and hosted this trilateral foreign ministers meeting, and it was actually Foreign Minister Wang Yi's first occasion to visit Japan as Foreign Minister of China after about 3.5 years. As you may know, he was ambassador to Tokyo between 2004 and 2007. And he is fluent in Japanese. His Japanese is excellent. So, and at that time, there were kind of expression of interest from the Chinese side to try to encourage Japanese companies to invest in China, or promoting free trade agreements among ASEAN plus 3 countries, 10 ASEAN members, and 3 countries, meaning Japan, China, and South Korea. And also, we have been negotiating trilateral FTA among Japan, China, and South Korea too. So it was actually before the U.S. Presidential election that, in my opinion, there was some kind of change of posture from Beijing, and I was kind of personally feeling that there may be possibility of improved relations between Japan and China. I was at that time leading the Japanese delegation for senior officials meeting on maritime affairs, focusing on East China Sea issues. That's the most difficult issues to talk between Japan and China. Our positions are different, but at the same time, I was personally feeling that there may be some limited progress in terms of our consultations, especially as related to establishing the crisis communication mechanism between Japan and China, between the 2 militaries. And of course, by establishing such a crisis communication mechanism, we can kind of prevent the possibility of starting of military conflicts between Japan and China. There are concerns among, say, international media or the experts of Asian affairs that there may be conflicts, between Japan and China after, autumn of 2012. So there were some steps forward being made at that time, and in September 2016, there was a G20 summit hosted by China, President Xi Jinping, in Hangzhou. And at that time, Prime Minister Abe invited Premier Lee to Japan for the trilateral summit to be held in Japan. So after foreign ministers meeting, we move on to the summit meeting. And actually, this trilateral summit was eventually held in Tokyo in May 2018. And Premier Lee paid an official bilateral visit to Japan, including Hokkaido, which was the first time in 8 years as a Chinese premier to officially visit Japan. And speaking of Hokkaido, which is a northern island of Japan, it's a very popular tourism destination for either Chinese or Australian people. Australian people want to come to Hokkaido for skiing. Then they can do skiing all year round. And by the way, Vice President Wang Qishan visited Japan last November, and he also visited Hokkaido. So Hokkaido is very popular among the Chinese tourists. And after that, in October 2018, Prime Minister Abe paid an official visit to Beijing, which was the first time during the last 7 years as Japanese Prime Minister. So we started to see the kind of the exchange of highest level mutual visits, and actually last June when Prime Minister Abe was hosting G20 summit in Osaka, in his meeting with President Xi, invited him for a state visit to Japan. So and this is going to happen this spring when cherry blossoms will be blooming. And this forthcoming visit by Chinese president is the first. The last visit was 12 years ago. So although we are neighboring countries, we haven't seen the Chinese president coming to Japan during the last 12 years. Again, last December, Prime Minister Abe visited China in conjunction with the trilateral summit. He went to Chengdu and also met with both President Xi and Premier Lee again. So, given these recent developments in bilateral relations, I would say that Japan-China relations have come back to the normal state of being able to engage in relatively constructive dialogues and negotiations. For example, Japanese companies in China have similar concerns regarding Chinese market access issues as American or European companies do in China. We have a Japanese Chamber of Commerce in China, which has been publishing annual white paper on Chinese economy and Japanese companies since 2010. Based on actual Japanese business activities across China, they compile annual reports with recommendations for policy and regulatory changes that could be implemented by the Chinese side. Last April, we held a ministerial high-level economic dialogue in Beijing between Japan and China. The one held in April of 2018 in Tokyo was after 8 years of absence, because of kind of a cooling of relations. Many of the high-level talks were suspended. At that time, last April, in Beijing, the Japanese ministers raised many issues of concerns regarding the Chinese market access issues, which include forced technology transfer, protection of intellectual property rights, treatment of data such as data localization requirements, industrial subsidies, along with the issues of Chinese embargo of food items from the 10 Japanese prefectures after Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. But I told you 10 prefectures, so it's not only limited to Fukushima, but it includes prefectures like Tokyo, Saitama, Chiba, Nagano, among others. So those people who know about geography of Japan, you can kind of understand, how wide, this area is. And basically, all the food items, including sake, are kind of prohibited. So this is the kind of big issue from a Japanese viewpoint. We don't think, there is a scientific basis for such import restrictions. So, in a sense, as I mentioned, the Japanese government has been raising almost identical issues of concerns toward the Chinese side regarding market access issues as the U.S. government has. And I think that rapprochement between Japan and China could be conducive to addressing some of the major issues of the Chinese market access and other trade impediments. In the meantime, with regard to East China Sea, we continue to be very concerned about the Chinese government vessels' activities near Senkaku Islands. Chinese intrusion into the Japanese territorial waters continue to this day. The situation in East China Sea has not improved. So we have also been urging the Chinese side to resume the negotiation of what we agreed in 2008 on joint development of resources in East China Sea. However, this Director General level consultation has not been held since 2010, during the last 10 years. Prime Minister Abe has been telling President Xi that without stability in East China Sea, there will be no genuine improvement in Japan-China relations. So now, after observing, what's been happening during the last several years, what are the lessons that we can learn? Today's talk is more as a private capacity. Actually, I don't work in Washington with the embassy, but I'm more of a visiting scholar. So I would just come up with my personal views, touching upon 6 issue areas: trade, technology, Indo-Pacific region, global issues, security, and the U.S.-Japan cooperation. Trade issues. First, as we saw the rising tension between the U.S. and China on trade issues, I think we need to understand more deeply about the emerging Chinese political economic landscape and what is the best way for us to realize China's conformity with international trade norms. It is true that the Chinese economic model is very different from the Western capitalist economies. There are many issues being raised regarding the Chinese trade practices, as I mentioned, as related to WTO rules. As U.S. government says, was it really a mistake to realize the entry of China into WTO in 2001? We are aware of shortcomings surrounding the current WTO rules and its dispute settlement mechanism. Yet I think we should not abandon WTO, but we should reform WTO where necessary. There is much need to agree on new trade rules that match the 21st century economic reality. In fact, there have been ongoing collaboration among the United States, Japan, and the EU on these issues. So, are there any other ways or tools that could be more effective? I'm glad to see the Phase 1 trade deal being reached between the US and China. And we hope that the trade negotiation toward the next phase between the US and Japan and China will continue. Prime Minister Abe has been also conveying the message to President Xi, stressing the importance of China further promoting reform and opening up, and realizing fair and just business environment. In my opinion, the Phase 1 deal has made notable progress on such issues as intellectual property rights protection and liberalization of financial services, as well as establishing a new bilateral dispute settlement mechanism between the United States and China. And generally speaking, I guess this is a positive news. At the same time, Japan is also concerned about possible negative economic impacts to be brought about by these continuing US-China trade frictions upon the global economy. For Japan, China is now the largest trading partner. The United States is the second. All of us are affected by these frictions, and I hope that there will be the conclusions or the settlement of issues to be reached between the United States and China. Between Japan and the United States, we came up with a new agreement, trade agreements, which was negotiated by our current Foreign Minister Motegi with U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer, which consists of U.S.-Japan trade agreement as well as a new U.S.-Japan agreement of digital trade. And this is a kind of cutting-edge agreement that could be reached between advanced in industrials economies, and I think this is a good news. Of course, as I mentioned, there's also much room for the U.S., Japan, and the EU to continue to closely cooperate in order to encourage China to further reform, as well as negotiate new trade rules in such fields as digital trade and subsidy issues. Technology issues. Having lived in China during the last 2 years before last summer, I have been impressed by the remarkable economic development of China. Not only metropolitan megacities such as Beijing and Shanghai, but also provincial cities in China such as Chengdu, Xi'an, Kunming, and Harbin. Those cities, the regional cities, are also developing, and they have achieved significant developments. And I understand that when more and more of those bright Chinese students having studied in the U.S. universities, including this university, when they go back to China, they will be contributing significantly the economic development of China. So my question is, what would be the realistic policy options that could most effectively address our concerns regarding China? Given the uniqueness of the Chinese economic system, we need to very carefully consider what would be the best approach to address the issues of our concerns. Observing the U.S. trade policy landscape, even with the Phase 1 deal, I notice that the U.S. government is at the same time preparing new regulations to prohibit exports and transfer of advanced technologies such as AI to China. I understand that interagency panel chaired by the Treasury Department is intensifying scrutiny of Chinese investments in US cutting-edge technologies. As many experts point out, there are talks of selective or partial decoupling between the United States and China, and that may be starting to happen. At the same time, we are seeing impressive progress of more Chinese sophisticated industries, including those under the Made in China 2025. By 2030, China intends to become the global leader in those high-tech industries, such as AI, now dominated by US firms. China published the next generation AI development plan in 2017, already 3 years ago. So China may continue to make remarkable progress in this field for years to come. Next, maybe taking a look at the broader landscape, Indo-Pacific region. We talk more about Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific these days. I think geographical notion has been transforming. According to Goldman Sachs forecast, in 2030, 10 years later, China will become the largest economy by GDP, followed by the United States, India, Brazil, and Japan. Brazil and Japan are about the same economic size. So you are talking about 4 out of 5 biggest economies in the world will be in Asia-Pacific region, or Indo-Pacific region. So Indo-Pacific region will be the center of the global economy. As you know, Prime Minister Abe has been promoting Abenomics. Japanese economy is also trying to go through another transformation. In Japan, we are now discussing how to win the next game of 6G, after 5G, and which is supposed to be 10 or 100 times faster than 5G by 2030. Of course, in this area, Japan and the United States together are starting to proactively engage the Indo-Pacific countries in the fields of energy, digital economy, and investment in infrastructure. So these create new business opportunities, and including for businesses in North Carolina. Next issue is global issues. As we see in the case of coronavirus, infectious disease goes across the borders. So I was checking the figures, and globally we have about over 8,000 people who have been infected, 7,000 in China. And in Japan, we have identified 14 individuals, including Chinese tourists coming to Japan, who have been infected. And I understand that in the US there are probably numbers like 6 individuals. So, and in China, I understand that 170 people passed away. So, and WHO, World Health Organization, just came up with the global, the identification of health emergency in China. For this kind of things to be addressed, we need international cooperation, and our foreign ministers between Japan and China have been communicating with each other on this, and we need the kind of global efforts to address these issues. This is not issues limited to China. And So this kind of global emerging crisis could affect the world economy. Of course, the city of Wuhan is a destination of Japanese investments. Again, Honda and its suppliers are there, and some of them, the production could be shifted, from Wuhan to the Philippines, for example. And so there are international supply chains that are affecting, which would translate into affecting production of automobiles globally. Of course, American companies, such as McDonald's, Starbucks, many of them are deciding to close some of their shops in Hubei and other areas. So, and Japanese clothes shop like Uniqlo is also doing this. Of course, this is to limit the contacts, between humans, for the time being, and we need precautionary measures. And I was just reading the news about Chinese tech companies like Alibaba or Tencent or Baidu trying to make use of AI and or big data for this. And I think this is a good way to use big data, respecting individuals' privacy issues, of course, and seems like there are some talks about coming up with nurse robots to address these issues. So there are opportunities for technologies, to be used for good purposes. As for this possibility of Japan-China cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, I should just say that, as you know, China has been engaged in Belt and Road Initiative. And China has been coming up with a continental Silk Road, or maritime Silk Road, or digital Silk Road, and there are lots of investments across the region. And there are international criticism against some of those projects as a kind of debt trap diplomacy. And so we need to be careful in terms of how those projects would affect, especially developing countries, sustainable developments. And on this, actually, Prime Minister Abe in 2017 mentioned the following, which I quote: "Belt and Road Initiative has the potential to connect the East and the West, as well as the diverse regions found in between." But he said that it is crucial for infrastructure to be open to use by all, and to be developed through procurement that is transparent and fair. He also said he further considered it essential for projects to be economically viable and to be financed by debt that can be repaid, and not to harm the soundness of debtor nations' finance. So, and at the end of that phrase, adding Japan is ready to extend cooperation from that perspective. So he is mentioning that there could be a possibility that Japan and China could cooperate on economic projects in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, Japan has been promoting free and open Indo-Pacific, and China is promoting Belt and Road Initiative. So when Japan is promoting our projects, it's according to free and open Indo-Pacific. And free and open Indo-Pacific means that we want the projects to be open, and we want to secure freedom of navigation and so forth. And but at the same time, as Prime Minister mentioned, broadly speaking, 4 conditions: openness, transparency, economic viability of the project, as well as fiscal sustainability of developing countries. So if there are conditions to be met, and if Chinese and Japanese companies work together, and if Japanese companies find them as a feasible economic projects, there may be possibility that the Japanese government also may extend support. So I guess I should wrap up by now. I would just comment at the end of my talk that we have witnessed this kind of a celebration of 60 years of alliance between Japan and United States. I met your student whose grandmother is from Okinawa, your assistant. And so there are some connections. I kind of, when I heard that, I thought that maybe grandmother or her grandfather may have served, for U.S. military, which include, for example, there is a large presence of Marines in Okinawa. Yokosuka hosts U.S. aircraft carrier. We have U.S. Air Force Base in Misawa and Yokota, and between our 2 militaries, we work together in order to cope with contingencies against North Korea's ballistic missile launches. And so what it means is U.S. forces and Japanese forces need to share what we call common situational awareness, and share the same pictures, share the same data, because you are talking about 10 minutes before those missiles may arrive in Japan. Or those missiles could be targeted at Guam. Or, as you are aware, North Korea's missile capabilities has been making progress, and now probably can reach continental United States. So we are talking about tackling common challenges. Of course, U.S. Marines based in Okinawa were dispatched to Iraq, to Fallujah, as I remember. I think it was around 2005 or 6. I think there was shortage of army deployments. And of course, U.S. Marines, with their amphibious capabilities, they have done, as I understand, great job. So, and also, very lastly, I should say that I extend my heartfelt appreciation for U.S. service members at the time of difficulties in Japan as a result of tsunami. What the U.S. forces did, both the U.S. Marines and Navies, and I guess the Air Force also deployed in terms of search and rescue. Because of tsunami, so many people were drowning. And also, they were instrumental in reconstructing the regional hub airport named Sendai Airport. So that was realized thanks to the U.S. service members who were deployed there from other parts of Japan. And this is remembered as very memorable stories among Japanese, reminding us about the kind of role that the U.S. forces can play under different contingencies. I know that from Marines in Okinawa also deployed to places like Philippines for typhoons and so forth. So we are not only talking about military contingencies, but coping with natural disasters. So in Japan, we have, I think, a very strong confidence on this alliance. After 60 years, we just celebrated 60 years of anniversary, but we are thinking, that our alliance will continue for years and decades to come.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We definitely learned a lot. But let me ask you about the East China Sea. What is actually going on there? And do you think that problem can easily be sorted out with Xi Jinping's visit to Tokyo in the spring?
Do I need to use microphone?
Yes, it's lying on your...
Okay. Of course, as I mentioned...
Take it, please, close to your mouth.
Okay. As I mentioned, the views between Japan and China on East China Sea, especially Senkaku Islands, are different.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not really easy to resolve issues. But we are hoping, that at least, there will not be kind of unilateral attempts to change the status quo. And we are worried, that those kind of attempts to change the status quo have been happening both in East China Sea and South China Sea.
But the islands in the East China Sea, which are claimed by Japan, are uninhabited, are they?
Basically, there was no precedent of China controlling those islands. So historically, Japan has always kind of maintained control. There were some industries before, so it's not our claim. We basically control the islands, and the U.S. government point of view is that this is the area where U.S.-Japan Security Treaty may be applied.
Mm-hmm.
Would be applied, and I guess for Japanese, there is no doubt that Senkaku Islands are part of Japanese territory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. When listening to you, I thought Japan seems to be in a very similar situation than the EU is, kind of torn between China and the United States, with of course longer standing links and more cultural value links to the United States, but still one also has to look after one's economy and one's living standards, and that is of course what China offers, a huge market, while the United States also offers a huge market to both the Europeans and of course to Japan. So is there a feeling in Japan that one has to really mediate between China and the United States and be careful not to be torn into either the American orbit or the Chinese orbit too much?
I don't know whether the U.S. needs Japan to be an intermediator between the U.S. and Japan, U.S. and China. It is true that historically Japan has absorbed lots of Chinese civilizations, including Buddhism or Chinese characters. So. In a sense, as Japanese, it's probably easier for us to understand, Chinese ways of thinking. Traditionally, we have learned Chinese classics, and we can kind of understand, what's written in Chinese papers and so forth. And also, we are situated so close to each other, and the business relations are so integrated that our ideal hope is that there will be de-escalation of tensions between the U.S. and China. And my personal hope, like as Prime Minister Abe mentioned, Japan wants to see further reform of China, and this was something that was started in 1978 by Mr. Deng Xiaoping, but probably there is a view that this kind of reform may not be taking place, and there are other questions such as WTO is not reaching agreement on new areas, such as digital trade.
Thank you. Does Japan feel threatened by China militarily? Clearly, Japan feels threatened by North Korea's nuclear arsenal, but does the same apply to China? Is it viewed as a military threat?
Officially, Japanese government does not regard China as military threat. In order to kind of constitute threats, we think that there is a requirement of both intention and the capability, and we think that China is having an increasing capability as its economy grows and so forth. But at the same time, China, unlike North Korea, has not declared that China could attack Japan. No, North Korea has been saying so. So it's a major difference. So I think there is room for us to do confidence building, and as we see in recent years, every year we have been seeing 1 million more Chinese people coming to Japan, and so last year was over 9 million Chinese people who came to Japan. So the so-called patriotic education or anti-Japanese education, which includes anti-Japanese elements as related to what happened during the pre-war or World War II era, this continues. But as a younger generation of Chinese people come to Japan, almost all of Chinese visitors to Japan become good friends of Japan. So I think that this kind of flow of exchange of people affecting the sentiments, and that's, I think, is a positive.
Okay. But Japan has been increasing its defense budget quite a lot since 2012 by 13%. That's not just against North Korea. So why is that happening?
Of course, Prime Minister Abe has been trying to increase its defense spending, and it's not really easy in Japan because after World War II, we introduced pacifist constitution, and spending on military is not the most popular thing for you to do. But objectively speaking, East Asian military balance has been shifting, and we need to be better prepared. And there are other issues like the soldiers or service members are getting older, and how do we manage militaries under democracy? There are issues, and the weapon systems are becoming more expensive, and of course, Japan has been buying lots of weapons from the United States.
Much to President Trump's pleasure, I would say. But doesn't Japan feel in that kind of battle between the giants, China and the United States, that Japan, as a much smaller country, still important, but a lot smaller, like Europe in a way, is being really torn apart and is being really losing out?
As I mentioned at the initial remark, Japanese foreign and security policy is based on U.S.-Japan security alliance. And this is the kind of a consequence of the World War II. But at the same time, this continues during the last 60 years. And when the Cold War was over and the Soviet Union was gone, there were some views that the U.S.-Japan alliance may not be necessary. But there was a re-evaluation of the U.S.-Japan security alliance, and there was a strong case that was made in the mid-90s among U.S. security policy makers that we need to continue this alliance. Of course, the Cold War is not really over in East Asia. And of course, there are questions of uncertainty surrounding China. For example, we don't know exactly how much China is spending on military. So we have been urging, including the US, Japan, and Europe, have been urging China to be more transparent on their military spendings.
Thank you. China's Belt and Road Initiative is controversial. By some it's seen as highly positive, by others it's seen as negative, including by many European countries and the United States. How does Japan see it, or is Japan about to join up to the Belt and Road Initiative?
So China hosted two Belt and Road Forum. It's a kind of summit, for Belt and Road Initiative. Basically, the U.S. government didn't send any senior official to the last one. Neither did India. And what Japan did is Japanese delegation was headed by Secretary General of the ruling party, so not represented by the cabinet minister. And there was a formation of a Japanese delegation. So our approach is, as I mentioned, Prime Minister Abe has this kind of view that there needs to be conditions, to be met. And inside Japan, there are some criticism, that what China has been doing as related to Belt and Road initiatives. Some of the cases, like in the port investment, exclusive use of ports in Sri Lanka, which is called Hambantota. It's not the very popular ones, because when Sri Lanka found it difficult, to repay the debt, then Chinese side has been kind of coming up with a request, for the exclusive use of the port. So there are some controversial elements, but at the same time, we are not denying, the possibilities of cooperation in the future if conditions are met.
Thank you. Have you met Xi Jinping? What's he like?
Well, so only time that I met President Xi Jinping is when I accompanied from Tokyo to Beijing for the first Belt and Road Forum. Yeah. And our delegation was headed by Secretary General of the Liberal Democratic Party. By that time, our relations were improving, as I mentioned. I guess it was May 2017, 3 years ago, and and our head of delegation has been very deeply engaged with the Chinese friends. So he was received very kind of warmly, and so atmosphere was pretty warm, and so President Xi was shaking hands with all the delegation members from Japan.
I've asked that before in a different context. Do you think it would be good fun to have a drink with Xi Jinping?
Yeah, that's a difficult question for me to answer.
You should say yes, of course. Thank you very much. Let's open it to questions from the audience. Any questions, please? Over there, this person there. Yes. Can you wait for the microphone? We do have a microphone. Who is going?
Hi. Yeah. So, thank you for your lecture, and I have two questions. First, as you mentioned, Japan is a strong ally with the United States, and it seems like this relationship has lasted for like 60 years. And would you think that, because the big scenario, the big game is that Japan China and United States are kind of want to have a conflict in Asia-Pacific, and they want to project their power into those countries. Do you think it's inevitable for Japan to side with United States if there is a future warfare between United States and China?
All right, thank you.
And second question is, do you think that in that scenario, let's put it straightforward, United States is the obstacle between a good Japan and China relationship because United States has such strong military and political presence in Japan that it's impossible for Japan to side with China in the future game? Thanks.
Thank you.
Can you ask them to identify themselves?
Yes. Could you tell us your name and what's your role here at UNC, please?
I'm Alex, and I'm junior student, history and philosophy major at UNC.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question. As I mentioned, we have alliance between the United States and Japan. So when there are kind of contingencies in and surrounding Japan, we would be kind of tackling issues based on our alliance. So this is pretty straightforward, clear. But I don't know, how China, what kind of role China may be playing, under those situations, and of course, it depends on the situations, and so it's kind of difficult for me to say. But generally speaking, the alliance relation is very special, and we are attentive to so-called alliance management issues. It's like those who are married, like managing your family, or managing your relations with your spouse, for example. Like you need to pay attention to each other, and so you need to invest in your family life and so forth. So sometimes, of course, Japan and the United States, of course, we fought the war, and there are lots of challenges, to overcome, those difficulties. But 60 years ago, the current, Prime Minister Abe's grandfather paid a trip to Washington D.C. and met President Eisenhower, and they played golf at the Burning Tree Golf Club in near Washington D.C. But it was only once. So between President Trump and Prime Minister Abe, they have been playing, I guess, 4 times. I don't know, whether it makes a huge difference or not. But anyhow, regarding your question, our security policy is formed because our constitution kind of limits our ability to come up with, say, offensive capabilities, and we don't have nuclear weapons. So there are nuclear powers, including China or North Korea in the region. So I guess at this point in time, and for foreseeable future, Japan's security policy is based on U.S.-Japan alliance.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, here, this gentleman. Can you wait for the microphone, which is coming here?
Yes, thank you very much for your talk.
Can you stand up and also identify yourself, please?
Okay. Dave Seidemore, I'm a resident of Chapel Hill. You stated that the Chinese economic model is different from that of Western capitalism. Based on your years of study and also in being in China, how would you describe the Chinese economic model, and especially in reference to Western capitalism?
It's actually a very difficult question to answer, but to put it simply, of course, China started with state-owned enterprises. So As I mentioned, in the process of reform and opening up, there have been gradual, privatization of companies or state-owned enterprises. So when you look at the Chinese economy today, the proportion of what we call SOE, state-owned enterprises, is smaller, much smaller. So the big companies like Alibaba or even Huawei, Tencent, Baidu, they are private companies. But there are other dimensions, that China came up with a unique model of the party controlling the entire economic system, and also, if you look at, for example, universities, the number one person is usually Secretary General, so Communist Party person. And maybe if you're talking about Secretary General of Beijing University, he could be at the level of cabinet minister or at least vice minister. So those kind of things happen. And if you're talking about state-owned enterprises in energy sector, telecom, those are still state-owned, and also banks. So when you look at the most recent reshuffling of those personnel at the top, you see, the Communist Party deciding, the personnel. So it's a very different system. It's like in the case of U.S., like this university or companies, like Boeing, Procter & Gamble, Facebook, and those different companies all belong to the party's control. But I'm saying that if you look at the statistics, the proportion of state-owned enterprises are not huge. And I know that international economists argue that the productivity of state-owned enterprises is not that good. So there may be de facto subsidy given, from private companies to the SOEs.
Thank you. Any more questions? Here's this gentleman there in the red t-shirt. Yep.
How's it going? My name is Michael. I'm a student at UNC. So, to my understanding, the Second World War still colors a lot of Japanese or Chinese perceptions of Japan in everyday life. I wonder if you can speak to whether or not that still influences a lot of trade tension, as well as the trade relationship on the state level as well.
So your point of question is, could you just repeat Second World War and?
If the legacies of the Second World War still affects a lot of these current contemporary trade relationships.
For China, from a Chinese perspective to Japan. So, as I mentioned, 1978. Before that, we did not have deep, trade relations. Although there were some limited, trade relations between Japan and China in the 60s, but the major development were taking place between from 1978. And depending on how you look at it, Japan-China relations were at their best between 1978 and 1991 or 2. And this is the theme of Professor Ezra Vogel at Harvard. He came up with 500 pages of a book under the title of China and Japan Facing History. He basically analyzed Japan-China relations since, I guess, the 6th century. And his argument is that most of the time, Japan-China relations were positive. So Japan was initially learning from Chinese civilizations, and that's why we still use Chinese characters. Most neighboring countries like Korea or Vietnam don't. So we don't have any kind of objections against the Chinese civilizations. And also, as I mentioned, like 78 and 91, there was golden period. Japanese companies invested in China. But probably you could make a case that after Tiananmen incidents, the Chinese domestic political landscape, went through major changes, and there was, as I mentioned, introduction of a patriotic education, maybe around 1992. So after that, there was kind of more difficult relations starting to take place. So at this point of time, however, as I mentioned, there is a rapprochement process going on. So I don't see, say, major anti-Japanese developments or sentiments in China. And during my 2 years in Beijing, I did not personally felt any kind of negative reactions, from Chinese friends, and so I would say that like issues like trade issues, maybe from Chinese point of view, we could be regarded as moderate. Like there are other stronger messages, coming from other places.
Thank you. Over there, please. Yeah, here. There's a lady here.
Hi, I'm Cecilia. I'm an undergrad here in UNC. If China refused to adopt any progressive reforms in the near future, do you think Japan would continue to treat China as their biggest trading partner, or will Japan adopt any retaliation or punishment to enforce the reforms?
I don't think Japan is in a kind of punishing mode. We are, as I mentioned, Japan's largest trading partner is China, and we see opportunities in Chinese market. We mean Japanese companies. So unless Chinese business environment deteriorates, very bad, I think the Japanese companies will try to stay there. But when business conditions change, such as escalation of U.S.-China, the trade relations, like if your Japanese company is investing in China and try to export to the U.S., or even U.S. companies investing in China export to U.S., if they are under tariffs, they may not make economic sense. So I see some examples of relocation of factories from China to, for example, Southeast Asia. But it's not only because of U.S.-China trade war, trade frictions, but say, as labor cost in China is going up, and of course there's a issue of kind of middle income, trap. China is now, is not a follower or catch up state. So China needs to come up with more indigenous, innovative industries or brands, right? So I think this is something that Chinese companies are working on. But at the same time, how many Chinese brands do we know living in the United States, right? So I would say that there's potential for Chinese economy to grow, but this kind of the frictions may become obstacles.
Thank you. You mentioned before the Huawei issue. How is Japan's position on that issue? As you know, the British recently decided they would accept Huawei for their G5 network, but not in the core of their networks, but the rest is fine. Has Japan decided what to do?
So we our policy is that basically we do not discriminate according to nationality, and but at the same time, Japanese government introduced in December 2018 new guidelines for government procurement for IT equipment from the viewpoint of strengthening cybersecurity. Of course, for government IT equipment, you need to ensure cyber security. And in April of last year, the Japanese government extended approved application from 4 Japanese telecom operators for 5G. And of course, in the context of approving these new licenses, there are governmental kind of evaluation of cybersecurity too. But we haven't said that explicitly don't use Huawei. But I haven't heard Japanese companies using like announcing their plan to use Huawei for 5G. Although like we have 5G smartphones, like Huawei phones are sold in Japan, and also and as more Chinese tourists come to Japan, you can start to use WeChat Pay and Alipay in Japan too.
All right, thank you very much. This gentleman there.
Good evening. My name is Chris. I'm a Peace, War, and Defense major and a public policy major. Space is the new warfighting domain. And 10 days ago, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe announced the creation of the latest world power space force, the Space Domain Mission Unit out of Japan. And I quote, he said, "We will drastically bolster capability and system in order to secure superiority." Some in our country seem like Japan is undergoing a process of rearmament or remilitarization. I want to know your thoughts on this. I want to know if you have any more information on the Space Force out of Japan. And is it your opinion that East Asia is in the process of being divided into 2 armed camps situated between Washington and Beijing, respectively? Thank you.
Of course, we are, as you mentioned, the Japanese government announced its intention to create forces dedicated to space-related matters. But our view is that the space should be used for peaceful purposes. Of course, our intention is not to start a war in the space, but in order to ensure defense of Japan or from security point of view, unless we cover space, it's not enough. And I guess this is something, of course, President Trump announced the new how do you call it? Space Force, right? So there may be some similarities, but I would think that our announcements in substance is a lot more modest. But without engaging with space-related issues, there is a stronger awareness that we cannot, address the security issues, and this is where we are starting to more proactively cooperate between the United States and Japan. So this is something we will be working between U.S. and Japan. And as for this divides Washington and Beijing, so as I say repeatedly, we our cornerstone of our policy, foreign and security policy, is a U.S.-Japan alliance, and so we are now trying to engage with other like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Australia or India, or there are other external powers, such as France or UK, expressing interest in Indo-Pacific region. I was just asking a question to French defense minister the day before yesterday, who came to Harbour, and actually French ambassador responded that France is naturally interested in Indo-Pacific issues, because there are French territories in South Pacific. Or if you talk to British people, like there are like Diego Garcia, the traditional deployment of Royal Navy in the region. So what we are trying to achieve is addressing issues according to international law and prevent attempts by any party to change the status quo unilaterally. And if there are disputes, they should be resolved according to international law.
Thank you. Is the EU represented in the area?
Not, like EU. I don't think is represented in the context of Indo-Pacific per se. But between Japan and EU, of course, we are becoming closer. We have just the Japan-EU FTA entered into force, and there was accompanying political agreements being reached, and so we are having a deeper dialogue between Japan and EU. And when I was in Beijing, I was in close contact with EU delegations. And also, of course, British, French, and German embassies as well. Yes.
Thank you. Over there. Sorry, you have asked the question before. I need to take someone else. Yeah, here. Listen. Yeah, let me. No, sorry. So let this gentleman first ask a question. Then we'll come back to you at some stage. Okay.
My name is Jeremy Smith, and I live in Durham. And first of all, thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed your presentation. I had an observation and a question. The observation was when you spoke about globalization issues, you didn't mention climate change, which surprised me. My question is about the American withdrawal from TPP and what impact that had on your ability to deal with other trading partners. Did it have a negative impact? Did it harm you in any way, or was it just a non-event for you?
This is a good question. Climate change issue is something traditionally we have been working between the United States and Japan, and maybe with the current administration, we are discussing cooperation in the context of energy related cooperation, and so the current administration in the United States, no kind of objections against use of energy efficient technologies. And there are rooms, for us to collaborate, between U.S. and Japan in the Indo-Pacific regions. And so actually, as I mentioned, we are discussing the kind of concrete projects for cooperation between the U.S. and Japan in the Indo-Pacific arenas, including energy field. Energy, digital trade, and connectivity of infrastructure. So, and also we are talking about smart cities, for example. And we are aware of the political landscape in the United States, that there are powers in the states or local municipalities,
Yes.
right? So when I talk to my friends in California, they are introducing some innovative solutions for tackling climate change. So there are kind of partnering between Japanese and American cities or municipalities, and that's where there are lots of opportunities ahead, I think. And as related to TPP, of course, our hope was that the U.S. will join TPP at the end of the day, but it has become clear that the President Trump doesn't want to do it. Then, as I mentioned, there was a conclusion of negotiation between U.S. and Japan on trade agreements, 2 agreements. So that's a good step forward. Of course, it's not resolving all the issues, and I guess this depends on the political debates in this country about trade issues. I was just in Ohio last week, and the trade issues are politically quite divisive, and so at the end of the day, unless you have a kind of a political support, especially in U.S. Congress, the FTAs will not be passed. Like we have just seen USMCA, but we noticed that the name is changed, and NAFTA was a North American Free Trade Agreement, but now we call it USMCA, right? So of course this is I guess a political issue in the United States. But as I mentioned, U.S. and Japan, our 2 governments are collaborating on trade issues, including on WTO reform issues.
Did the American withdrawal from TPP diminish your negotiating ability with China or other countries?
We are continuing our negotiation of ASEAN plus 3 FTA, which is called RCEP. And then after we conclude our RCEP negotiation, which actually there's an India issue. India is ASEAN plus 6. Sorry, my initial explanation is wrong. Not ASEAN plus 3, but ASEAN plus 6, meaning 6 means Japan, China, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand. So this negotiation, has been facing some difficulties, maybe as related to China and India related issues. But we are kind of forthcoming in coming up with more FTAs, because it's favorable for Japanese companies for investing overseas, creating new supply chains, and more FTA coverage, so to speak, we have, the better. So we have at least, Japan-EU FTA is concluded, and it's going to give lots of business opportunities between Japan and EU. And we need to think about what to do with UK. Probably UK wants to join TPP.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe back to this gentleman.
Thank you for your speech, and I'm a leading scholar of UNC. And my question for you is, we all know that there is a Five Eyes Alliance, the intelligence sharing organization. As far as I know, that it seems that Japan, France, and South Korea are considering joining the Five Eyes Alliance. Would you make some comments on this potential Eight Eyes Alliance, and what will be the main difference from the Five Eyes, where it's mainly focused on Indo-Pacific, as it seems that there are only two countries, UK and France. Others are all in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Right now, I'm not working at the embassy in Washington, D.C., so my answer to your question is I don't know. I have read the reports, media reports about this kind of ideas, but frankly speaking, I don't know about it. At the same time, between the United States and Japan, we exchange military intelligence. In order to cope with North Korean the threats, we need to exchange some information. Or U.S. forces in Japan collect some of the information from that region. Of course, if you visit some of U.S. bases in Japan, there are equipments that realize this kind of collection of the signal intelligence. But as I already mentioned, we are kind of expanding our security partners, like-minded countries, like Australia. I was working in London to strengthen our security partnership with the UK, France is another one, and on many issues like between Japan and India, we have a meeting of our minds on some of the concerns regarding security issues in the region. So, generally speaking, our policy, of course, as I mentioned repeatedly, U.S.-Japan alliance is the basis. There is no alliance like that, but at the same time, we are trying to engage with other countries.
Thank you very much. Has anyone got a final urgent question? Over there, this lady here.
Hi, first, thank you for your speech. So I'm Jin Yu and I'm an undergraduate at UNC. So my question is, as we already know that Taiwan recently got election and President Tsai Ing-wen was re-elected. And I want to ask, how does it change and maybe further influence the future relationship between Japan, China, and Taiwan?
Of course, when we normalize our relations with China, we basically stopped our diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And so it's a bit, it's almost identical with what the U.S. government did, on this issue. Actually, among Japanese ruling party members, this was very controversial. There have been pro-Taiwan MPs in Japanese parliament. But of course, we made a decision as a government to form diplomatic ties with Beijing. At the same time, people in Taiwan have been, a lot of them have been visiting Japan. In terms of proportion of the people coming to Japan, I guess you're talking about maybe over 2 million Taiwanese people coming to Japan. And so given the size of the population, do you know the population of Taiwan? Maybe about, is it something like 20 million? So it's a large number. So in terms of people coming to Japan, as related to population, Taiwan and Hong Kong are the largest. So people in Taiwan and people in Hong Kong tend to have a very, I think generally speaking, pretty positive view of Japan. So there are unofficial exchanges of relations, and after tsunami, lots of help, like sympathy extended from Taiwan too. So that's something we recognize. Of course, there was support coming from mainland China too. Of course, this is something, Taiwan-related issues are very sensitive issues from the eyes of Beijing. But we have been managing, de facto relations with Taiwan, based on like cultural exchanges or trade relations, among others.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we have exhausted you. Thank you very much for coming, and it was very informative indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, our next talk is on the 12th of February, which exceptionally is a Wednesday, and we will talk about Russia, Putin's paradox, and it will be Richard Sackler from the University of Kent in the UK and Ambassador Jack Matlock, the former US ambassador to the Soviet Union. He will respond to what Richard has got to say. So I hope you will all be back on the 12th of February. Thanks very much and good night.